The forward command post sat on the edge of a dusty airfield. The kind of place where the ground never really settles and the air always tastes like grit. It was the early 2000s. And the night had a tired, mechanical rhythm as engines cooled outside and distant rotors came and went like restless thoughts. A sandstorm was pushing in from the dark, turning the horizon into a smudged line and making every light look dimmer than it should. Even before dawn, the wind was already lying about what you could see. Inside the brigade tactical operations center, the air felt old and recycled, warm from bodies and electronics that never truly shut down. Worn monitors flickered with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance feeds that jumped and stuttered, like the picture itself was fighting to stay awake. Radios crackled with overlapping nets, voices stepping on each other, corrections layered over corrections, and the constant background hiss that meant distance and dust were doing their job. The staff moved around a map board under harsh light, building a plan for a dawn convoy and a hostage recovery cordon, as if the lines they drew could hold the world still. In the back corner sat a coffee urn that never stopped steaming, not because it was loved, but because it was necessary. Next to it was a printer that jammed every third page, coughing out paper like it was irritated by the workload and the hour. Specialist Erin Hale stood there in that corner, a United States Army Specialist E4, attached temporarily as a geospatial intelligence analyst, parked beside the coffee and the printer like she was another piece of equipment. She kept her eyes down, her hands busy, and her expression calm in the way you learn to be calm when people only notice you if something goes wrong. The staff barely looked her way unless the coffee ran low or the printer made a noise that promised trouble. Someone brushed past and told her to keep the coffee hot. Then another voice floated back with, "Keep the printer running." Like those were her actual missions tonight. Erin did not answer. Not because she could not, but because she had learned what happens when you take up space in the wrong room. She poured. She unjammed. She stacked paper. And she listened to every word the radios spat into the stale air. Around 2:30 a.m., the radio tone shifted, the way it does when a routine update starts to carry an edge. A patrol checked in with sporadic contact near the intended route. Short bursts of information slipping through the static as the net tried to keep it clean. Another report followed, a civilian saying there was fresh digging near a culvert. And the phrase landed in the room like a warning that did not have time to explain itself. At the map board, the colonel raised a marker toward the laminated sheet, ready to draw confident arrows as if the plan were gospel, while the storm pressed closer and the radios hinted that reality was already changing. Specialist Erin Hale was the kind of soldier who showed up before anyone asked, not to impress anyone, but because the work always got heavier the later you waited. She was a 35 Golf geospatial intelligence analyst, attached temporarily to the brigade staff, which sounded important until you saw where they placed her. In the Tactical Operations Center, her space was the corner with the coffee urn and the printer, the spot people treated like the supply closet, with a heartbeat. Nobody said she did not belong. They just acted like she was supposed to stay out of the way. Back home, Erin had been the quiet kid in community college who could make a map tell the truth. Geographic information systems made sense to her because it was clean and exact. Layers lining up the way the world should. She could read terrain like a sentence and spot patterns without forcing it. And her instructors used to say she had a feel for it. But tuition and bills do not care about talent. And by the time she enlisted, the student loan letters felt like they were following her into every room. The Army gave her a path, and it gave her a uniform, but it did not promise she would fit in. In the Brigade Tactical Operations Center, fitting in meant talking like you owned the space. It meant jokes that landed fast, confident opinions thrown out before the full picture was even on the screen, and a kind of casual power that came from rank and familiarity. Erin did not do any of that. and the room read her silence as smallness. She did not argue rank. She did not interrupt a brief. And she did not remind anyone what her job title actually was. So, the staff learned to use her the way they use the coffee urn, as something that should always be ready. Her nights looked the same from a distance, but up close they were full of little choices that kept the place running. She refilled the urn before it hit empty. Because an empty urn made people angry in a way that never showed up on a mission slide. She cleared the printer jams with steady hands, smoothing wrinkled pages and restacking them so the map products stayed clean. She organized folders, checked the date stamps, and made sure the right overlays ended up in the right hands, even when nobody asked her name. While officers and non-commissioned officers spoke over her, Erin listened, because listening was still a way of working. After the shift, when the room finally thinned and the radios softened, she stayed behind. That was when the real work happened. The kind nobody requested because they did not know to request it. Erin built a shadow-layered map pack off hours, stacking route gradients with culvert locations, likely improvised explosive device choke points, and wind and visibility trends that could change everything at first light. She pulled in imagery updates and change detection cues, then tested the layers against what the patrols had been reporting all week. It was the kind of package that could keep a convoy from becoming predictable. She kept it to herself because she still remembered the last time she had tried to help the wrong way. A senior non-commissioned officer had been certain about a detail, and Erin had corrected it, calm and factual, the way she would have done in a classroom. The correction did not land as help. It landed as attitude. And the punishment came in the form of cold looks and quiet warnings that she should know her place. Even now, when someone walked past her corner too fast, her shoulders tightened without permission. Her face stayed neutral, but her hands always paused for half a beat before she moved again. The coffee urn sat there like a symbol of the whole problem, steaming steadily while everyone forgot to ask who kept it that way. Erin was competent, but wrapped in silence. Her competence got miscategorized as service. Across the room, the map board began to fill with confident arrows and clean lines as the plan took shape. Erin watched it happen while the printer hummed beside her, and she chose to stay small for the moment, even though she could feel the data and the terrain refusing to match the certainty in that room. In the Brigade Tactical Operations Center, the map board became the center of gravity, the place where every voice eventually angled toward a single decision. The brigade commander, a United States Army colonel, stood close enough to the laminated map that the marker squeaked when it touched plastic. The executive officer pushed the timeline with a quiet intensity, keeping track of what had to be locked in before first light. The operations officer drove coordination, asking for updates in a clipped rhythm, while the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance feeds flickered behind him like tired eyes. The colonel drew arrows with the confidence of someone used to making time obey him. Each line looked clean and certain, and the room treated those lines as if they were already real. Staff members leaned in and asked for clean map products and quick answers, wanting the plan printed and packaged before anyone had time to second-guess it. Someone called out for a fresh overlay, and another voice asked if the latest graphic matched the board. Erin Hale stayed in her corner, stacking paper and watching the plan harden simply because momentum had a rank. The route depended on a bridge crossing that sat on the current map like a promise. On paper, it was the simplest way to move the convoy at dawn. A clean line that kept the cordon tight and the timing neat. But Erin had been tracking recent imagery updates, and the change detection cues were not subtle if you knew what to look for. The crossing was compromised, and the river current was up. The kind of detail that turns a neat plan into a trap. She could see it in her mind as clearly as if she were standing there, water pushing harder than the map admitted. Outside, the sandstorm kept building, and the airfield lights looked softer through the dust. Visibility was dropping by the minute, and the closer it got to dawn, the more expensive every mistake became. If the convoy rolled out blind into the wrong terrain, there would be no easy correction once engines were moving and radios were busy. The room felt that pressure, and it made people cling to certainty, even if the certainty was drawn with a marker. Erin felt it too, but for her, it did not feel like a schedule. It felt like the weight of lives. She heard someone call the colonel sir with the smoothness of habit, then heard the operations officer snap back, a confirmation, and keep things moving. Nobody called for the geospatial analyst in the corner, and nobody asked what the imagery said today. Erin kept her face neutral, because she had learned that the room could punish the wrong kind of helpful. Her binder sat close, heavy with layers she had built in silence, and her hand stayed on the printer tray as if that were where she belonged. She watched the arrows form and felt the familiar pull to stay quiet. The plan kept tightening, pieces snapping into place as if the map board itself were a clock. The bridge crossing stayed in the center of the route like a fixed point, and the colonel's lines began to look final. Erin's eyes moved from the arrows to the flickering feed, then back to the board, and she could not shake the sense of a funnel closing. One wrong turn, at first light, could compress the convoy into terrain that rewarded ambush, not movement. In the corner, the coffee urn steamed steadily, and Erin stood beside it, listening to the ticking silence between radio calls and realizing the plan was almost locked. The radio tone changed again, sharper this time, and the whole tactical operations center seemed to lean toward the speaker without realizing it. A patrol checked in near the intended route, the words arriving in broken pieces through dust and distance, then falling into static like they had been dropped. Someone at the operations desk repeated the key fragments out loud, confirming what was heard and what was only guessed, trying to turn interference into a clear picture. The colonel stayed at the map board, marker in hand, but his eyes flicked once toward the radios before returning to the plan. Sporadic contact was never a comfortable phrase, because it sounded small until it suddenly was not. The staff tried to keep the update contained, asked for location references, asked if it was one burst or multiple, then asked if the patrol could push without getting pinned. The sandstorm made every transmission feel farther away than it should have been, like the air itself was eating the signal. Erin Hale listened from her corner, not writing anything down because she already knew her brain would hold it. Her focus sharpened the way it always did when people started speaking in fragments. Then another report surfaced, passed from one person to another until it landed on the operations officer's desk. A civilian had mentioned fresh digging around a culvert, close to the same general area where the convoy was planned to roll at dawn. The staff treated it like a line item at first, something to be filed and weighed later, because there were a dozen things competing for attention. But Erin's body reacted before her thoughts did. A subtle tightening in her shoulders, and a slow inhale. Fresh digging near a culvert was not just a detail, it was a question mark placed on the road. Her overlay flashed in her mind, not as a file, but as a warning. That culvert sat in a spot where the terrain squeezed movement, where a slight slope forced vehicles to slow and bunch up, and where a canal berm shaped the edges like walls. If a convoy hit that point at speed, it would still have to brake. And braking meant compression. Compression meant predictable spacing. And predictable spacing was exactly what improvised explosive devices and small arms fire were built to punish. Erin did not picture explosions. She pictured the simple math of stalled movement in a narrow place. Across the room, the map board plan kept its momentum, because time pressure has its own authority. The executive officer pushed for final products, and the operations officer kept coordination moving toward first light, trying to keep the whole thing from drifting. Erin heard, "Keep the printer running," from someone who did not even look back, and she swallowed the impulse to answer. The colonel still leaned toward the existing route. Because a plan that is already drawn feels safer than one that needs to be changed. Erin watched the marker hover over the bridge crossing, watched the arrow trace toward the culvert area, and felt the air in her chest get tighter. She looked from the radio speaker to the map arrows and then down to her binder. Like her eyes were moving along, a decision she was not ready to make. If she stayed silent, the convoy could roll into a funnel, and the cost would not be a reprimand or a bruised ego. It would be real soldiers in real vehicles trapped by terrain and timing. And there would be no clean undo button once the wheels were turning. Erin's hand settled on the binder. Fingers spread. Steady but tense. The countdown to dawn kept ticking, and she froze in the space between staying small and stepping forward. Erin Hale felt the decision hit her before she fully named it. Her hand was still on her binder. Fingers spread like she was holding it down so it would not betray her. And her throat went dry in the way it always did right before risk. She took one steady breath and let it out slow. The way you do when you need your voice to come out clean. The coffee urn hissed behind her, and the printer hummed. But she stopped hearing them. She stepped out of the corner and the room did not notice at first. Because everyone was locked on the map board and the clock. Then someone caught the movement and their head turned. And that tiny shift started a chain reaction. A specialist walking toward the board in the middle of a planning brief was not normal. Not in front of a colonel. Erin's boots sounded louder than she expected on the hard floor. And the weight of the binder in her hands felt heavier with every step. She kept her face neutral, because she knew emotion would be used against her. The colonel was still at the board. Marker poised. Lines already drawn with authority. Erin stopped at a respectful distance, squared her shoulders, and spoke the way she had been trained to speak upward. "Sir, that crossing isn't viable. It hasn't been for 48 hours. Her voice was calm and even. Not loud. Not timid. Just clear. And the effect was immediate. Like a switch had been flipped in the room. The radio noise did not stop. But it faded into the background because every person in that space was suddenly listening to a different kind of signal. Erin set her binder on the edge of the table and opened it with careful hands. As if she were handling something fragile. She laid down her updated overlay on the laminated map, aligning corners and grid lines so it sat true instead of crooked. Then she pointed to the bridge crossing that the plan depended on, showing the change detection imagery cues that indicated damage and a compromised span. She did not argue. She demonstrated. And that difference mattered. Her finger moved with purpose, tracing from the crossing to the route the marker had drawn. She highlighted the terrain slope that would force vehicles to reduce speed. The kind of gradual grade that looks harmless until you see how it compresses spacing in a convoy. She marked the canal berm that boxed the roadway in, shaping a kill zone without needing any dramatic language. Then she shifted to an alternate route, showing how it offered better standoff and fewer choke points. Even if it looked less elegant on paper, every point she made stayed tied to the ground, to movement, to what happens when a plan meets a road. Around her, the staff held still, caught between habit and what they were watching unfold. Erin could feel eyes on the back of her neck, the silent question of who she thought she was. And she refused to answer it with anything but data. She kept her breathing steady and her tone flat, like a metronome, because she knew confidence without volume was harder to dismiss. The colonel's marker slowed in his hand, and the squeak of it against the board stopped, leaving a silence that felt thick. In that quiet, her overlay did not just disagree with the plan. It threatened to prove it wrong before dawn if they ignored her. No one moved for a moment, like the room needed time to adjust to the idea that the truth had come from the corner. Erin did not smile, and she did not soften her points. Because this was not about winning an argument. It was about preventing a mistake that would not be forgiven by daylight. She stood there, with her finger on the map, steady and exposed, waiting for the colonel to choose between the momentum of his arrows and the reality she had just placed on the board. For a few seconds, the room did not know what to do with what Erin had put on the board. The overlay lay flat and clean, aligned to the grid like it belonged there, and that alone felt like a challenge. A major near the edge of the group let out a small sound that could have been a laugh or a breath. Something dismissive but careful. He did not have to say much, because the habit in the room already wanted to push her back to the corner. Even the air felt tense, like it was waiting to see if rank would swallow truth. A senior non-commissioned officer stepped forward with a controlled calm. The kind of calm that carries authority without raising volume. He kept his eyes on Erin's hands instead of her face, like he was watching for a mistake he could use. He told her to stay on her task, to keep the coffee hot, to not interrupt the board. And he said it like he was restoring order. It was not a shout, and it was not cruel, which almost made it worse. It sounded official enough to make everyone else comfortable again. Erin felt the old memory hit her chest, quick and sharp, like a bruise being pressed. She remembered another room, another correction, another moment where facts had been treated as disrespect. She remembered the word attitude, said like a verdict, and the way people stopped making eye contact afterward. Her body wanted to retreat on instinct, to step back, to pick up the binder and disappear into useful silence. But she kept her feet planted and her shoulders level, because she knew the cost of backing down tonight. At the map board, the colonel's jaw tightened, and the marker in his hand stopped moving. The tension was not just anger. It was the pressure of being challenged in front of his staff, while the clock kept marching toward daylight. Nobody liked being corrected, but being corrected by a specialist in the middle of a brief carried an extra sting. It hurt most because she might be right, and everyone could feel that possibility hanging there. The silence got heavy enough that the radio hiss became louder, a constant reminder that the outside world was not waiting for anyone's pride. The executive officer shifted his weight, and the operations officer glanced between the colonel and the overlay like he was measuring how much time they could afford to lose. No one wanted to be the person who sided with the specialist too early, and no one wanted to be the person who ignored a warning that could get soldiers killed. Erin did not plead, and she did not get defensive, because either one would have made it easier to dismiss her. She kept her voice calm and her posture steady, letting the map do the arguing. Then she looked straight to the colonel, respectful and unblinking, and held her ground as the next few seconds gathered into a single decision point. Erin did not raise her voice to win the room. She did the opposite, and that made people lean in. She kept her eyes on the map and spoke in short, exact statements, the same way she had learned to brief when time and lives were both on the line. She referenced grid locations without turning it into a performance, pointing to the same squares over and over until the pattern became obvious. The longer she stayed calm, the harder it became for anyone to treat her like background noise. She tied the patrol's sporadic contact to the route line on the board, then slid her finger to the culvert the civilian report had flagged. Her overlay showed it as a choke point, not because it was dramatic, but because the terrain forced it to be one. The slope leading into that segment made vehicles bleed speed, and speed loss meant spacing collapsed and the convoy tightened into a predictable shape. The canal berm bordered the road like a hard edge, limiting lateral movement and narrowing options the moment anything went wrong. Erin kept her rhythm steady and let the logic build like a chain you could not break. If the lead vehicle slowed, the rest would stack behind it, and that stacking would happen right where the ground favored an attacker. In low visibility, drivers would hug the road, and that would make the whole formation even more centered and more predictable. She emphasized standoff without sounding like she was lecturing, simply showing how the alternate route gave more room and fewer forced slow points. Every sentence landed on a physical feature that existed outside the tent, which made it real. Then she delivered the clincher. Still calm. Still precise. She pointed to activity that matched an enemy pattern of life and aligned with the same choke point the colonel's arrow crossed. The kind of recurring movement that looks innocent until you watch it repeat. It was not a new report, and it was not a new event. It was the same information the staff already had, but organized into a warning they could not ignore. Her overlay did not just disagree with the plan. It predicted what would happen if they drove the convoy into that funnel at dawn. The prediction felt uncomfortable because it sounded like certainty. And certainty is usually reserved for people with higher rank. The room changed in small, visible ways. A staff captain who had been half turned away leaned closer to the board, eyes tracking Erin's finger instead of the colonel's marker. The operations officer stopped tapping his pen and stared at the culvert area like he was seeing it for the first time. Even the major who had smirked earlier went quiet, his expression flattening as the pieces clicked into place. Nobody was cheering, but the silence had shifted from resistance to calculation. The colonel did not look at Erin as a problem anymore. He looked at the map, then at the overlay, then back at the map again, and the marker in his hand seemed heavier with each pause. The staff waited for him to dismiss her or adopt her, because that was how decisions worked in that room. Erin stayed steady, respectful, and still, letting the facts occupy the space where ego had been a moment earlier. Finally, the colonel lowered his hand and set the marker down, slow and deliberate, as if he were acknowledging that the map was not a story to be drawn. It was a reality to be survived. The colonel's eyes stayed on the board for a beat, then lifted to Erin like he was seeing a new piece of the battlefield. His voice came out calm and final, the kind of tone that ends side conversations before they start. He addressed her the right way. "Specialist Hale, you are on this board. Brief it." The words landed with the weight of authority, and the room accepted them the same way it accepted any order from the brigade commander. You could feel the shift in posture around the table. People who had been angled away turned back in, and people who had been skeptical stopped looking for a reason to dismiss her. The operations officer nodded once, already recalculating timing in his head, and the executive officer stopped pushing paper long enough to listen. No one said sorry, and no one made a speech, because that is not how a tactical operations center works. The change showed up in the silence, in the way Erin suddenly had space to talk. Erin did not celebrate, and she did not gloat. She simply reached out and moved a single red pushpin on the map, about an inch, just enough to shift the route off the choke point and away from the compromised crossing. It was a small motion, almost nothing, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Tiny corrections save lives, and the pushpin was proof that survival sometimes comes down to details. Nobody applauds. The coffee urn still steamed in the corner, steady and ignored, and the marker lay where the colonel had set it down. A reminder that ego had paused long enough for truth to do its job. For the first time that night, Erin was not the person assigned to keep the caffeine flowing. She was a soldier doing exactly what she had trained to do, using the map to keep other soldiers alive. The room did not need fireworks to feel the release, because it was already clear what had been avoided. In a place where rank usually speaks first, disciplined truth had spoken at the right moment, and the plan was stronger for it.